Linux Foundation Networking now counts 7 open source projects within its umbrella, with further more than 20, in fact, related projects in Linux Foundation itself, plus a huge number of supporting member companies. Phil, thanks for joining us on TelecomTV again. We've spoken before about how LFN is engaging with vendors and operators and telcos, but given the increasing need for specialist skills, how are you collaborating with academia and academic institutions?
We do have an issue where, because there's such a shift that's happening inside of the whole telecom space, there's a lot of processes that are changing, a lot of new tools that are coming on board, basically an entire new way to manage a network that's much more flexible than it had been before and driven by a lot of automation, a lot of programmability. That means that there's a whole new set of skills that need to be acquired, and that includes those that are coming up out of university, right? So right now, many of the telecom providers are going through retraining their existing staff, but they're also looking for new talent that are coming out of university to be able to pick up that trend as well and move forward. So that's one area that we're seeing as a need. One of the problems with doing that is we've got professors who need content material to be able to teach. In working with a few of the professors that I have been, they make the statement to me that, Phil, when I used to teach this class, I would set up the class curriculum materials and it'd stay the same for 10 years. Right? It was the same CLI going to the same switch, to program routes and so forth. Because now you guys with this open source stuff, you're coming out with a new version every 6 months. The APIs change, the interface changes. How do I keep up with my classes? So trying to work with them so that they can collaborate with each other for having materials that they can share when they're teaching their classes at various universities is one of the areas that we're looking at. Another one is actually research, right? So again, 5G in particular, lots of rich opportunities for doing research in that space. And so using our tools, using the open source projects that we have as part of their research, so it's not necessarily research on our project, but it's the leveraging of our project so that they can do their research. This is another area that we're continuing to pursue with them. In the US, we've got a couple of different 5G test labs that are sponsored by NSF grants that are going to some of the universities. They're actually already running ONAP as one example of one of our LFN projects as part of that orchestration to be able to run these 5G use cases and 5G research projects. And so we want to continue to foster that more. We want to be more engaged and help those researchers and potential students in those classes to participate in our communities. So yet another area where we're looking to engage more with academia is, every project has a developer design forum. This is a face-to-face event where all the developers get together, typically close to the beginning of a release. And they talk about both what they're going to do in the next release, the short-term stuff, but that's also the place, because we have everybody in the room together, that they talk about long-term and larger things that will take multiple releases to get done and how they want to implement it in the code. And we're actually bringing, because we're now this umbrella and we have all these projects, we're trying to get those developer design forums to happen co-located across the projects, because these projects are leveraging each other. Right? ONAP actually uses Open Daylight. OPNFV is a large portion of the testing infrastructure for it. So there's a lot of overlap there. Getting those communities together provides for more collaboration across those projects. My problem is that each of these projects will typically have 200 to 300 developers at one of these events. I start to bring them together and there's an overlap, so it's not totally expansive, but I'm looking at a venue that's more like 600, 700, 800 developers. Finding a venue like that that's cost effective is actually difficult. So one of the things that I'm modeling after a conference called LinuxConf AU, which is a totally community-driven event in Australia and New Zealand, is they actually go and have a university provide facilities. Right? So the university provides the facilities. The community gets a low-cost venue that has auditoriums, it has lots of classrooms for breakout sessions, for all that good collaboration. The university gets their students get access to all of these leaders, all of the ideas and the development topics that they're doing. So it's a win-win between the academic institution as well as the community. So these are areas where, again, lots of rich things we can be doing to better engage our communities in and with these academic establishments or facilities, so that, again, it's a win-win for everybody.
I'd like to touch on one technology area that's getting a lot of interest. That's the network edge and edge computing. Again, it goes back to finite pool of developers, a lot of projects. There are a number of edge-related projects within our industry, focusing on different aspects and different sizes. LFN has the Acreno project. Where does that fit? What are you trying to achieve through it?
And the Acreno project is really just getting started. It's just getting launched. The community's coming together. We're figuring out our governance, exactly what are the things we want to produce, what do we want to call the things that we produce, how they actually fit together, and how we work with other projects as well. Not too dissimilar from OPNFV in the sense that ultimately we want to create a reference architecture, or actually a variety of different reference architectures for the different types of use cases we have at the edge leveraging these open source projects. So again, there are multiple different scenarios or end use cases that you need to satisfy, and so the hardware is different, the latency requirements are different, the actual software that you would run in the stack is different to be able to support those use cases. And so defining what those use cases are, identifying, again, what those physical requirements are, how does it need to be secure, what's the latency, what's its performance, what's the bandwidth throughput that it needs, all of those aspects, then tying that to a set of components that would facilitate that, and identifying, are there any gaps in these upstream projects that we actually are going to have to fill for those particular use cases. So very specifically focused at the edge, because there are so many different use cases, right? When we talk about 5G, you've heard all of the autonomous cars, the virtual reality, the Internet of Things, and so forth. Again, these each have different requirements and constraints around them, and they are going to require a different stack of software and hardware to satisfy. So figuring out what that is, figuring out what can be used, again, out of the open source community to do that, driving any necessary enhancements into those projects, bringing it down, testing it, and bringing it across. And yeah, there are several other activities. Certainly, we've got activity in Etsy with the mobile edge computing and so forth. And obviously, everybody, most of these organizations are participating in both of these, both the standards groups as well as the open source group. So being able to leverage the good work that's already being done there, making it a little more specific because you take it from a standard to an implementation, bringing out the problems that you have when you have an implementation, feeding that back up into the standards body, and that's good work that's just beginning now.
You've spoken about collaboration amongst projects within LFN, but what about those communities that are outside LFN, the adjacent communities? How do you go about engaging with those?
And that's a really interesting space as well. I think in my previous discussion here, I talked about how these industries are coming together when they see a technology pivot that they have to make. And so that's certainly not limited to telecom. We have similar projects that are working on the infotainment systems for automobiles, which is automotive grade Linux. We have first started with the financial industry, but now it's really spreading to many industries focused on the value of doing blockchain type of work. Obviously, we have the whole space in containers, somewhat the follow-on to virtual machines, and trying to get really granular with our functions, turning them into microservices, and then having APIs and the ability to spin those up, spin them down, make sure they're reliable and so forth. These are all different areas of technology focus that are getting traction significantly in open source, and they can all leverage each other. Again, as we look at the edge, and even if we look at just VNFs in general, regardless of where it is in the network, moving to containers is something that's very interesting. You can see a lot of it here at the show. You hear a lot about it in the keynotes. So that's definitely a space that's being explored. Again, having CNCF at the Linux Foundation as well as these networking projects, that collaboration can happen very easily since we organize the events. Again, getting these same groups of people together, we're finding that collaboration is starting. There's significant aspects there. again, blockchain and leveraging blockchain inside of networking, particularly for 5G, particularly again, as you break things into microservices, you now have a whole different architecture where there's a new set of attack surfaces, right, for security. So doing security through containers that are necessary for networking, it all fits together. Again, blockchain, same way, ties into that security aspect and being able to know who you're talking to through a trusted distributed ledger. So we see the leverage of these different technologies and the focus of that technology being in these different projects. Finding those intersection points now is really interesting. We haven't had this corpus of open source to leverage across these different industry needs before. And with it, again, it's quite exciting to see the different combinations and the way these communities are working together to fill those holes.
Well, Phil, good to talk to you again, as always, and thanks for joining us on Telecom TV.
Absolutely, thank you.